Welcome to the Benwood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey, welcome to the Benwood Johnson podcast. Today is September the 10th, 2018, and this is podcast number 15. It's been a very hectic couple of weeks. So many things have happened in my life during those past 2 weeks, and I needed sometimes, to recapture myself, to regain myself, to have a sense of direction, because I had lost that sense of direction during the last 2 weeks. So that's why I sort of didn't post, new materials. And I have posted a podcast about some of my personal experience. Please don't let that podcast change your perspective about me or about what it is that I'm here to do. The goal of these podcasts is to talk about philosophy, is to talk about, day-to-day philosophy, and particularly Jean-Paul Sartre and his approach to philosophy. Jean-Paul Sartre was an existentialist. And I do not consider myself an existentialist, although I share some of the ideas echoed by Jean-Paul Sartre himself. And I consider myself more like a survivalist. I believe in the philosophy that's going to allow the individual to survive in his environment. I don't believe in this philosophy that tells the individual you are free to be, when in fact the individual is never free to be. There are so many constraints in the world of the individual, in the world of the being, and I think Sartrean philosophy, or the philosophy of existentialism, fails to disclose those obstacles to the individuals, and that's why I don't necessarily see the world from that particular angle. And anyway, in this particular podcast, we are going back to Jean-Paul Sartre. We are going to talk about his approach to the power of the human consciousness. As an existentialist, Sartre believes that the individual has the ultimate decision. The individual has the ultimate power to decide his present, and therefore the individual has the capacity to shape his future. So today we're going to be talking about the power of the consciousness, where the individual is able to tailor a reality for the self. Of course, this is still within the confound of the context of bad faith, but here we're going to dig a little deeper in this concept. We're going to elaborate a little more on this notion of the power of the mind, of the capacity to construe a world for the being himself. So without further ado, let us delve right into it. Jean-Paul Sartre has a clear understanding regarding the power of the consciousness and the force and the role, if you will, the force of circumstances in his philosophy. Sartre understood the consciousness, the capacity or the ability of the individual to be aware of the self within his environment was important. It is paramount for the individual to understand the relationship between what we call the object and the in itself. Okay? It is what Sartre calls the ego, or the in itself, the objectification of the self, or the objectification of myself. Okay? It is what we could understand as the psyche of the self. Now, this is important to understand, because when we're talking about phenomenology, the concept of phenomenology, which sort of explains the notion of ontology, human ontology, is the study of the being every experience of the being. In other words, the understanding of the being as both a subject and an object. Okay? Sartre did not invent this approach to the being. When we're talking about the concept of phenomenology, it's this idea that Sartre sort of inspired from other philosophers, from other writers. And one of the most potent figures in Sartre's philosophy is Hegel. Okay? Sartre understood the being and the non-being as contradictory. So Sartre said the being and the non-being are contradictory in the sense that the being is undifferentiated. Okay? But what brings about the difference between a being and a non-being? This is what Sartre refers to as the absolute being versus the indifferentiated being, or the being versus the non-being. Sartre talks about this notion of lack. Okay? You're witnessing the self. It's a presence to self. And the notion of lack sort of explains this idea that the consciousness is not one to itself. So a consciousness is not one to itself. Out of a lack comes a desire to get what we lack. Okay? And that desire leads to action. And that action is in turn informed by our values. So to understand why people act, so you need to understand what the individual lacks. According to Sartre, a lack leads to desire. A desire leads to act or an action. And that action is motivated by values. And values are in turn informed by a self-identity. And that self-identity is what gives meaning to the self, to the being. And that's what differentiates the being from the non-being. Okay? It's this idea that there's a back and forth between the lack, or what the being lacks, and the actions that the being poses. And what that means in simple terms is that if we want something so bad and we cannot have it, we have a tendency or an inclination to pretend to have it. So we want to identify as a way to find meaning with what we lack. In other words, we tend to present ourselves in a way that justifies what we need. And we give meaning to those necessities or proclivities, if you will. So in a sense, Sartre is referring to this idea that, going back to the whole concept of bad faith, mauvaise foi, if you will. It's this idea that the individual, at the end of the day, is trying to distinguish the self with the non-self. In other words, the individual is trying to separate the self from the object and the subject. The individual is trying to be something other than what he is. And that, at the end of the day, leads the individual to a point where the individual can assess meaning to not only the self, but also to the things or entities around the self. And that is what Sartre defines as the lack, or perhaps the quest for identity, the quest for meaning. Okay? Where the individual is sort of a presence to the self. And that's why when we're talking about the power of the consciousness in Sartre's philosophy, it's a power that is, to this day, unmeasurable in philosophy, in human philosophy, okay? No philosopher has come close to refuting those ideas evoked by Jean-Paul Sartre. Those ideas articulated by Jean-Paul Sartre. Okay? It is this notion that the individual is always in the search of meaning. And the reason the individual is in the search of meaning is because the individual is aware of the self. And as the individual is aware of the self, the individual understands that there are certain lacks, certain voids, certain emptiness, certain flaws in the self. And the individual is trying to fill those gaps. And in trying to fill those gaps, the individual is also looking for meaning about the self. And this is this idea of the lack, as Sartre defines it. It's this idea that the individual is trying to come up with a way to fulfill his desire to be. A lack is going to lead to a desire, which in turn is going to lead to an act. And that act is going to be informed by the individual's values, which in turn informs the individual's identity. And in the process, the individual finds meaning to whatever that lack is. Sartre also said that the individual has a tendency to create, at least to pretend to fill the gaps that the individual has witnessed in the self. Okay? The individual has a tendency to frustrate, at least to try to frustrate that lack, that emptiness, that void in the self. And this is, in a sense, the quest for meaning. And this is, in a sense, what motivates the individual. This is, in a sense, what drives the individual. This is what guides the individual in the world.